Why is it a threat? Why is that a threat? Best question you can ever ask. Why? It drills straight down and looks for reasons. We can find ourselves with a worldview that's essentially dangerously inaccurate. And if you don't really know what's going on, if you don't know what are the key true ideas in society, when we're going through things like alleged pandemics and alleged climate emergencies, we need to be able to know what are the real threats and what are the politically useful threats that can be used to motivate. Because of course ideas are the key to motivating human behaviour. But we have to grasp the context of the human experience, is that some men have always been controlling others. That it didn't start last week, last decade, or even 100 years ago.
Living outside the matrix, what does that mean exactly? And is it possible for us? To answer this question and more, I'm delighted to be joined by Nigel Howitt, who is a writer, philosopher, a lifestyle design pioneer with a special interest in the study of knowledge and our thinking skills. And having worked as an airline pilot for 25 years, he retired to begin his podcast, Living Outside the Matrix, in 2017. Initially focusing on how to maintain health and longevity, his investigations have now covered most of the major deceptions of our time. He's currently working on his forthcoming book, The Truth Seeker's Guide, Fundamentals, Principles, and Methods for the Curious Mind. He's also a passionate campaigner for freedom and human flourishment through reasoned argument. He'll also be joining us at the People's Reset this September in Bath. Nigel, we're here in Bournemouth at the studio. As we record this, Bournemouth Air Show is about to kick off. So for our listeners and viewers at home, if you hear random sounds of airplanes, it's not Nigel's ride waiting to pick him up. He's retired from the airline world of airplanes. But we're here to talk about something more fundamental today. So it's great to have you here to have this discussion. And I'd like to just begin by asking, what does it mean to live outside the matrix? At least, what is your definition of that question?
Well, hi, Dan. It's a great pleasure to be here. Yeah, living outside the matrix, I consider it in a nutshell sort of achieving personal sovereignty, really, trying to extricate ourselves from a system, a way of living that we don't want, that isn't delivering freedom, and trying to move towards a different way of living necessarily outside of what we could call the mainstream narrative, the mainstream cultural download of ideas.
And the Matrix itself, for those who have seen the film, they'll have an idea of what it could mean to be within a matrix. What's your definition, and how did you come to that definition of what it is what is the Matrix?
Yeah, what is the Matrix? Well, yeah, people are probably familiar with the film starring Keanu Reeves, the Matrix series, where Morpheus famously says it's the world that's been pulled over our eyes. And I think of the Matrix as a set of ideas, basically, because what is this whole struggle for freedom about? I think it's a war of ideas. It's individual battles for our minds. So the Matrix is a framework of ideas, and of course the word matrix has several meanings if you look up, Google it or look in the dictionary, and one of them is a sort of a lattice structure, and I relate that to the ideas that we grow up with, the ideas we hear all around us from school and from our peers and so forth, and indeed to some extent the ideas we generate ourselves. So this is the mainstream narrative, the mainstream cultural download sort of provides us with a framework of ideas that I think then we have the responsibility to question if we want to choose to live differently. Otherwise, of course, we just get swept along with the cultural current, and which is currently heading towards an unfree future, as we're all aware.
Are we in a matrix by default? Has there been a period in history where such a matrix hasn't existed?
I think there's always some kind of matrix of ideas, necessarily. Ideas are the currency of thought, and the way we humans function, we process ideas, we're exposed to ideas all the time. We exercise our free will to a certain extent. Of course, there's the subconscious operating as well, but it's all about ideas. So I think actually there's always some kind of framework of accepted ideas, even back in tribal times and any kind of cultural context.
Yes, you and I have been in a workshop today with David Shower-Lambos, and he always references, often references Plato's quote, which is, "Those who tell the stories rule society." And in many ways, when you talk about those ideas, to me, it's those who have the power to influence ideas. May have changed over time, and we are living in a time now where ideas can be shared at record speed, but we can also see that it can be curtailed at record speed. They can be shut down, censored, misappropriated, smeared. So therefore, we're in this melting pot of ideas that is incredibly difficult to navigate. And, you know, your work is about navigating those ideas, helping provide people with the tools to navigate those ideas, which I'm curious to explore in itself in terms of some of those methodologies. But first, I'm curious to know, you know, you've had a career where you've had a unique perspective on the world. You know, flying airplanes gives you, you know, a view from a height that most people don't get to see on a daily basis. Has this influenced the way that you look at knowledge, you know, from that elevated perspective? And before we answer that, I'm curious, how did you go from becoming a pilot to this path where your path is about this exploration of knowledge? Has that always been part of your DNA?
Well, the first part of the question, yes, it has influenced my thinking and my whole approach to solving this problem of how do we deal with ideas. And I conclude that we need a means of validating ideas. We need to be able to discern which ideas are safe to act on and which are not. In other words, which are true and which are false. So the experience of literally, you know, flying at altitude and looking down at various countries with that sort of metaphorical and indeed literal 30,000-foot view, that has helped me realize the importance of context and realize the importance to zoom out and check the bigger picture. It's really key and important to zoom in. It's important to go down those rabbit holes in our research, but we have to remember to come back out and climb back up to integrate what we find with the big picture. So,
what's the risk if we don't do that?
Well, if we don't do that, we can find ourselves with a worldview that's essentially dangerously inaccurate. And if you don't really know what's going on, if you don't know what are the key true ideas in society, when we're going through things like alleged pandemics and alleged climate emergencies, we need to be able to know what are the real threats and what are the politically useful threats that can be used to motivate. Because, of course, ideas are the key to motivating human behavior. Ideas are very powerful. So, so we need a means to validate them. And I found my career in flying very, very useful because in terms of flying an aeroplane from A to B, rationality and dealing with the facts of reality is what it's all about. So my mind was very much in a rational mode. And for most of my life, I've also sort of been a mystic. I was raised a Catholic and had various ideas which were sort of in some ways at odds with the reality-focused approach. So I was sort of, my mind was sort of divided, you could say. So coming from that perspective, it was quite useful to approach this methodology of validating ideas right from the ground up, as it were, from these two seeming contradictory, well, they're not seemingly, they are contradictory methods. And it's given me an ability to sort of integrate the two and work out, what we should be doing and what we shouldn't.
Yeah, so, well, I'm curious about that then, because I know we're going to talk about subjectivity and the role that plays in the kind of environment that we're in now. But before we get to that, how do you then square that, the mystical with the rational? How do you bring together the unexplained or some would describe as unexplainable, or the phenomena that we can't even observe with our senses? How do you square that kind of mystical element or the unexplained with the rational? What's your take on that?
Well, let's define the mystical approach and the rational approach. The rational approach is real world, it's evidence-based, it's facts, proof, logic, these sorts of things, the rational approach. Mysticism it's the practice of accepting ideas without reasons Having been raised a Catholic, I was told to accept various aspects of the Catholic doctrine, and the nuns who taught me in a convent school specifically said, "Oh, well, you don't worry if you don't understand it, because to have faith, which is a component of mysticism, obviously, faith, the practice of believing without reasons, this was sold to me as a virtue." So so mysticism is essentially accepting ideas that aren't rationally explainable. They're not supported by reasons. So my insight now is that if we wish to achieve certainty, particularly with issues such as, do I take part in this experimental medical procedure? Should I go along with the idea of living in a 15-minute city and curtail my vehicle use? We need a level of certainty that I think the standard we need is beyond a reasonable doubt. No accident that's the same that the court systems use. I'm no fan of the court systems. They have their corruption and their problems, but their standard of certainty is very useful. And to all practical purposes, that's all you need. If you have no reasonable doubts, no reasoned doubts that can undermine a conclusion, then you can be safe that idea is good to act on. So I would say that rationality should always be the sanction of our convictions, and should always be the ultimate, the ultimate sanction of determining our action. Feelings, on the other hand, and mystic ideas, I don't think that they have that much value. But this is not to say that feelings and these things don't have any value. Particularly, things like hunches, gut feeling, intuition, those sorts of ways of describing the communications we get from our subconscious. Our subconscious, as we know, absorbs far more information than the conscious mind. The subconscious, it's difficult to get past the subconscious, subliminals and repetition, all these sorts of things. It's all downloaded, and our subconscious can often see things or want to signal things that our conscious mind's not aware of. So I think things like intuition, gut feeling have a very valid place in truth seeking. If you're a detective and you have a hunch, it's a great idea to follow that lead. So I see intuition as a guide of where to dig, if you like, where to go looking. And but ultimately, I wouldn't be happy, and I would not advocate anybody take a decision that has high consequences to one's lifestyle, one's well-being, one's ability to thrive, without a standard of certainty to beyond a reasonable doubt. And in my view, that can only be achieved through the rational approach.
Do you think our emotions can override that rationality? So, for instance, you talked about the experimental jab program. People, and also this links to the point of the human need for certainty. So if they're living in an environment, whether it's been, a genuine threat or manufactured, if a lion walks into this room, I don't know your background in lion taming skills, but I'm sorry, I don't have
Pretty
any.
sparse.
That there'll be some level of navigating that threat as it arises. We probably wouldn't ignore it.
No.
But we also know that the idea of a crisis can be manufactured, and to help people navigate that crisis, often people mobilize to try and create certainty again, and there's usually an outside solution to bring that certainty once more. And does that environment then create the conditions where people may operate more in line with an emotional response to it, to return to that sense of safety? And would that override the circuitry that would warrant the questions that would normally be asked around the intervention they're taking, say an experimental intervention?
Yeah, I think that it all comes down to our knowledge base, because our feelings and our emotions are contingent on our knowledge base. If you knew nothing about a lion and you didn't know that it was a threat to your life, a child, for example, a young child, you need the knowledge base that is a threat in order for it to inform your emotional capability or emotional faculty. So we have, and of course there's a value system as well. We value our life. So it's the combination of your value system and your knowledge which gives you an emotional response. And of course, if a lion burst into the room, we'd act appropriately because our knowledge base is updated appropriately on that respect.
Yes.
The problem is that when we're talking about experimental medical procedures and so forth, and a lot of pressure to take part in them, using the fear motivation, of course, don't kill granny, and nobody wants to die, of course. So the challenge is for people's knowledge base to be up to date. So is it a real threat? Is what I'm hearing, is this message a genuine one? And this comes back to the idea of validating ideas. And it's not easy. You can't just do it just like that. It's not an instant download. You can't just watch a TikTok video to give you the answer. It's a process.
You mean knowledge can't be found in a tweet or a 90-second video?
It's piecemeal, isn't it?
Yes,
Knowledge is a structure that we
Yes.
build, and it takes a lot of time and effort to build it. And one of this key concept of achieving personal sovereignty, to be able to live differently, to achieve freedom, is this painstakingly long process of achieving knowledge.
Yes. You've described your work as being self-defense or truth seekers. Could you explain what you mean by that?
Yes, self-defense in that the ideas that are spun and put about in the media, for the political, in order to sort of steer our behaviour towards ultimately a political goal, because I don't think it's a secret that there's a political agenda towards collectivism, to diminishing our freedoms, towards greater control for those few at the top of the de facto power pyramid. So there is this agenda, and they're using ideas to control us because ideas are powerful. If you believe that the sun is harmful and the solution is sun cream, you slap on your sun cream. So ideas are very powerful. They motivate us, and of course the people, the people that are propagandizing us know this. And so we need to be able to spot things like logical fallacies. We need to be able to spot problems in the reasoned argument. Well, in fact, if we rewind just a little bit, we need to be looking for the reasoned argument in order to determine whether a threat is real or not. Why is it a threat? Why is that a threat? Best question you can ever ask. Why? It drills straight down and looks for reasons. So if we're asking the question, why is this idea of a climate emergency a threat, we need to be able to assess the answers that we get. And of course, we're not necessarily going around asking people why. You ask yourself that, and you do your research to answer the questions, or you find out what the narrative is saying. What are these climate alarmists saying? That is their reason. And this is the process where logical fallacies can obscure the truth. And there are some quite obvious logical fallacies, but the point is that if we're astute in our logical thinking, if we practice our thinking skills and our method, and if we're based on sound principles, we can be much more confident, not only at not falling into these traps of logical fallacies ourselves when we're explaining something, but also not falling for them when arguments or alleged arguments are used against us. And it's usually possible to see that in the mainstream narrative around things like pandemics and climate change, it's usually just a series of assertions. If you listen with a critical ear to a lot of the news, you won't actually ever hear any reasons. The reasons are all assumed. That was sort of last year's discussion, and we talked about that last decade. We're all on board with the conclusion. So this means that the truth seeker has to do some digging. You've got to find out what are the alleged reasons. Mm. And to answer your question, a bit of a long way of answering your question there, but the point is being able to spot errors in the logical construction of arguments, because if it's a fallacious argument, if it's not valid, then the conclusion should be disregarded. It should not be taken as a fact, and certainly shouldn't be acted on.
Yeah. So again, I suppose coming back to the lion example and the humans' drive towards certainty, and I'm visualizing the scene in The Matrix where time is slowed down to avoid the bullet. When we live in this potential, this world of crises, and actually the Collins World of the Year last year or the year before was permacrisis, and the UN is meeting this September, and actually not very long from here, in 20 odd days, to allegedly declare a planetary emergency, which doesn't have any, at this point, predefined parameters. Now, going back to the Plato reference, if those who tell the stories rule society, they have the ability to make this emergency seem like the exact same as having a lion walk through the door. It makes it they can play with the unknown to such an extent that it feels like an immediate present threat. I mean, I believe when I watch people how they act irrationally during COVID, it was to a degree it was because that intensity of the fear that was manufactured created the sense of present invisible fear. You know, if a lion walks in, at least we can see the darn thing.
Yeah.
You know, part of me might want to look it in the eyes and try and sense it out. The other part of me wants to jump out the window. But at least in that environment, I know I've got very little time to make an assessment. But we live in a world now where it feels like that every risk is collapsed to this emergency threat that it has the same risk as a lion being in your face.
Yeah,
in which case we don't have the time to pontificate or go into the philosophical argument and address the logical fallacies, or at least that's the perception that's created, and therefore we're not then having those discussions. And that for me
that is true, yeah.
part of the breakdown. And I'm also curious about this in terms of your perception about your journey of pursuit of knowledge and truth. To what degree do you think that's an individual plight versus a shared plight? Because we live in an increasingly fragmented and isolated world. And of course, if you put a lockdown into the situation, you're in a really fragmented, isolated world. So our ability to connect and share information, whilst we can do it online, is very different to our ability to sit across from one another and actually reason with each other.
Yeah.
So to what extent do you think we can come to those rational outcomes or understandings individually versus as a group?
Okay, again, first part of the question, the Plato thing of, he who controls the narrative, tells the stories, controls things, only in a context where the receivers of the message, the listeners, aren't critically evaluating that story.
Yeah.
And of course, maybe we're at an early stage in the evolution of humanity and becoming more conscious. But for me, the concept of becoming more conscious is to be more proactively sifting through the ideas we're exposed to. And this isn't something you can reach for overnight, of course, it's a long-term solution. And I would say that freedom is a long-term solution. This is a long-term thing we have to work towards. So unfortunately, there aren't any quick, easy solutions, but we have to develop a way of using our consciousness that results in us being the gatekeeper of our minds in terms of validating these ideas before we let them in, before we allow them to take root. But almost before that, the thinker, the truth seeker, in order to develop their immunity to being controlled by the narrative, you need to choose your fundamental convictions. Again, let's use the word becoming more conscious, because we all act on fundamental premises, fundamental presuppositions, if you could say, really basic philosophical ideas that nobody talks about, but we act upon them as a presupposition. So what I think of as becoming more conscious is bringing these up to the conscious level, actually thinking, well, what do I think about this issue and that issue? And it could be helpful if somebody illustrates the issue, obviously, which is where I see my role, in doing that. But when we start to question these fundamental ideas, determine which side of the fence we're on, because quite often it's an either-or sort of fork in the road.
Is that a fallacy in itself, though? I mean, it feels like the world is always being presented in binaries when the situation is...
No, there are real divisions. There is hot and cold is real. Freedom and slavery are very real things.
True, but between hot and cold, there is warm and lukewarm and freezing and
okay. But the point is there is right and wrong. There's a right way for you and I to conduct ourselves, i.e., and we all act on this implicitly, the non-aggression principle. We all agree implicitly. We haven't said anything about this, but we've of course agreed to treat each other with respect and to listen to each other and all of these things which broadly speaking, come under the non-aggression principle. I'm treating you as a sovereign entity, you're a sovereign human being, and you're reciprocating. So what I'm talking about here is sorry to finish that point. Non-aggression principle versus using force. That there's a difference between the non-aggression principle and a punch in the face that's very, very real. So there is a difference, and there is a right and a wrong. I think a lot of the time this gets blurred. So in terms of these fundamental ideas, if we can bring them into full consciousness, if we examine them, decide which side of the fence we're on, and then say, actually, I can see that I'm acting on that decision in my everyday practical life. Why would I hold an intellectual, conceptual idea that I've heard in the narrative that contradicts that? So, and this is pointing to another fundamental principle of thinking, the non-contradiction principle, but maybe we'll come on to that. The point of becoming more conscious, becoming more able to defend ourselves against these ideas that can steer our behavior is to bring these fundamental convictions up to the conscious level, be conscious of them, and then act on them, think on them consistently.
Is there a risk if subjectivity comes into this equation? How does that create a risk? Because just in the example that we use, hot and cold, I challenge that there's boiling, there's various degrees of hot and cold. Therefore, and also, there may not be a universal, or it would be very difficult for us to quantify if my interpretation of what is hot, my tolerance to heat or cold. Bear in mind, I go cold swimming every Friday. My tolerance to cold water is massively increased. We'd probably still define it as cold, but there is a degree of, my skin may have got different tolerances to different temperatures. So then how do we agree upon something? So take it to the non-aggression principle, which I find fascinating because I talked to Jeffrey Tucker about this, who's well known as a historical libertarian, and non-aggression principle is a very strong part of that. And we grappled with this idea because we said, well, what happened to libertarians during COVID, who are normally freedom-loving individuals who became very compliant? And we grappled with the idea of non-aggression when it becomes subjective. And this will bring into another conversation that you and I have had today around contagion, because the idea that if you are led to believe that you can cause harm to another through simply breathing, then for a libertarian that poses a quandary, because if you are led to believe that you have a symptomless illness, but you could infect someone else with a symptomless illness, and we are likely on the same page about these things, but if that is your belief and your understanding, and even if it is quantifiably true, how do you then decide what is harmful to one another in order to be deemed non-aggressive? And then I'm breaking all my own rules of podcasting here by asking two questions at once every time.
You're making it harder for me.
I'm making it harder because I'm catching myself doing it. But I want to give another. So you've got one example like that where there is a potential for quantification, and then you have this other far more subjective realm. I grew up in an age where there was a phrase that would be bandied around the playground, which was "sticks and stones may break my bones, but words may never hurt me." But we live in a world now where words hurt me more than stones. Not for me personally. I've grown resilience, and dealing with criticism is still hard. It still produces a reaction. But actually those reactions in some way strengthen me every time. But we live in a world now that's trying to shut down the ability to have difficult conversations. So I could disagree with you something now. And if you say you raise your voice a little bit to make your point, I could see you're being aggressive. I won't do that, and I don't do that because I don't think it's helpful. But some might. And therefore, is that then aggressive? Are you then... And so is aggression in the eyes of the beholder? And how challenging does subjectivism make it for us to live in that
there's
worldview?
I'm answering your most recent question, so forgive me if I've forgotten the first one. But with regards to non-aggression, I think I've lost the point.
I laid into you with a 4 or 5.
so many points coming at us. You were talking about the objectiveness of aggression. I mean, it's. Are you messing with me? Are you Are you coercing me? Am I being coerced? Is the bottom line when we're talking about the theory, germ theory, the idea that a particle might injure me. So you cough over there in the other side of the room, and are you harming me? This is where we come back to working out, is this a real threat or not a real threat? Is this idea true or false? Because there is an answer to that. Either germ theory is a thing or it isn't. It can't be both. You can't have germ theory and not germ theory at the same time, because contradictions don't exist. So it needs to be determined. Now, when you bear in mind things like the Rosenau experiments during the Spanish flu of 1918, I think it was, and they had bodily fluids exchanged and people coughing and sneezing and breathing into the faces of healthy people. These were sick people breathing in and doing these things in the faces of healthy people, and they didn't manage to get anybody sick. They were trying very hard to prove germ theory at that time, and the alleged Spanish flu was a great opportunity to do so. They categorically failed to do that. So we must factor these things in, and I'm not making an argument for or against germ theory. I'm simply illustrating the intellectual process of arriving at the identification of a true idea or false idea. So whether or not it's true or false.
What if some of the evidence changes over time?
Well, evidence can't change. It can be presented differently, and this is it's not easy. We're bombarded with ideas that contradict each other.
It's our interpretation of the evidence that can change.
Yeah, absolutely, and we're bombarded with different conclusions, interpretations from other people. We've got our own interpretations changing on the basis of our knowledge base. So that's important aside there. Our knowledge base is something we have control over, and we can do the research. Obviously, we've got limited time and division of labour and all these things mitigate against that. But knowledge base is key, which is why lifelong learning should be a habit for everybody. But it comes down to the fact that, yes, either germ theory is a thing or it isn't. So whether or not it harms other people, whether or not you're aggressing against people, if you can call it that, I'd hesitate to call it that. But if it were a real thing, just suppose it were and we knew it, if we were to go around coughing and sneezing when we've got a nasty disease, that would be an abhorrent action. That would be...
Well, the intent is important there in a way, because this is also my challenge with the emotional side of aggression or non-aggression. And I want to use this as a container for us to explore the concept of subjectivity and subjectivism, which you said previously is something that undermines truth and freedom, which we can see here, because it's very difficult, because what I find offensive could be different to what you find offensive. But I could say something to you with no intent whatsoever to hurt your feelings or trigger what would be described as a negative response or anger or frustration. So my intent could be completely pure, but I can't control what you've said. But we now live in a world where that intent doesn't matter. We're into this very subjective world.
Maybe if I can just interject,
Yeah.
Before we go there, let's just look at subjectivism. Of course, we have to define what we're talking about. I'm talking about philosophical subjectivism rather than one's subjective experience.
Yes.
So these are two different ways of using the word. So philosophical subjectivism is the idea that human consciousness creates reality in a metaphysical sense. And we're not talking about how our human consciousness creates our lives by the choices we take.
Yes.
Obviously, we have an enormous ability to create our lives using our consciousness. But we're talking in the philosophical sense of literally creating reality. So we're talking human consciousness observing things into existence. Consciousness comes first. That's philosophical subjectivism. It's the idea of subjective experience and indeed subjective truths is something different, and they're very real. If you're hungry, it's true for you, and it's a subjective experience. It only becomes an objective fact if you were to tell me about it or somebody else. So the subjective is very real. People have subjective experiences. Obviously, all our lives are subjective all the time. But that is not the same as philosophical subjectivism. The opposite of philosophical subjectivism is the idea that reality comes first. It's an objective absolute. And the important point to notice here when we're talking about philosophical subjectivism is that we all operate on the presupposition of an objective reality all the time. Human functionality rests on that presupposition. Also, it's demonstrable. We can't change the identity of things by observing them, looking at them. We can't make water flow uphill or fire cool you down. These are the things that we have to accept. So I've lost my thread now. Yeah, subjectivism. So the point is that we are already operating on the presupposition of an objective reality, which is why the idea of philosophical subjectivism, which can be quite, it is quite popular, it's quite appealing. That's why that's such a dangerous idea and why it undermines truth and freedom, because ultimately, if reality is anything that human consciousness dictates or thinks or believes, then you've removed your standard of truth. You've removed the base of human knowledge. What's knowledge? Our common understanding of the concept of knowledge is knowledge pertains to reality. It pertains to what is, all that exists. So if we throw out that, the basis of our knowledge is gone, and we look intellectually foolish, if nothing else. We're getting our thinking upside down by questioning the ground we're standing on, if you like. So, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. Maybe you want to go back to
I want to unpack that and how that relates to the kind of risk scenario we're in right now, because it does feel like objective reality is under threat. We can defy it. It's almost, we live in a world where I can call myself an apple, and if
you identify as one,
as one, and demand that you treat me like an apple, just don't eat me.
Yeah.
And that's a silly example to illustrate something that is an undercurrent in our society right now. Yeah. And as a result, it does feel like there is a war on objective truth.
Yes, there is.
And as such, our ability to then rationalize in that environment is compromised, and therefore, you're absolutely right, our freedom and truth does become threatened by that.
Yeah.
What's driving that, do you think? Is this like an offshoot of the rise of postmodernism? Is what's led this trend, do you think?
I see a wave of irrationality sweeping across Western culture, of which the example you just cited is a trivial and yet real example. The whole gender madness, all sorts of things. I see this as deliberate because the propagandists, the people who are running the show, the people behind the Davos meetings and the World Economic Forum, they've done their homework. They've done a lot of thinking. They're not just waking up. They've been awake for a long time, these people. And just a quick tangent is that we have to grasp the context of the human experience, is that some men have always been controlling others. It didn't start last week, last decade, or even 100 years ago. Some men have been exploiting and controlling others ever since. Overt slavery, of course, only just ending just a little over 150 years ago. So that's an important coordinate for all of us, an important part of the context. And, the works of Niccolo Machiavelli and people like this, if we go back 400 or 500 years ago, he was writing books on how, leaders and kings could control and manipulate their populations by intellectual means with ideas and also using brute force. So, of course, today we've evolved beyond the brute force because it's too obvious. We can't... I hesitate to use the word they, but the people who are trying to control us, the people behind the narratives, they do know what they're doing, and they're not using brute force, they're using ideas. And the point is that with fundamental ideas and subjectivism versus objectivism, if you can call it that, so the recognition of reality as a real objective absolute, as a sacrosanct principle to stand on in all of our intellectual knowledge acquisition, versus the idea that we create reality, this is a really important fork in the road, right at the base of philosophy and human thought. And one side leads to human functionality and eventually to truth and freedom and all and flourishment and all the things that stem from that. The other side leads to no standard of truth. What's knowledge? Can't be certain. Well, let's all use our feelings because we've lost rational thinking. Uncertainty. it leads to an inability to actually reason for freedom. I mean, we've got to be able to stand up and say, why the hell do we need freedom? People say, why do you need freedom? Well, we've got to be able to come up with reasons. All of this is compromised on this other track. And I think that the people that are calling the shots and that are those orchestrators of the narrative, if you like, and using that Platonic quote you mentioned earlier, they know this, and they know that that fundamental idea will derail a population's capacity to be intellectually resistant to slavery. So again, a very long answer to your question, but we had the Renaissance after the Dark Ages. We had the rebirth of reason, and this gave birth, to, as many people know, to the Age of Enlightenment, to the scientific and industrial revolutions. It gave us all of this technology that we now take for granted. This is just an opinion, so this is not fact. But in my opinion, on the basis of the Enlightenment demonstrably delivering the goods for humanity, standards of living being raised all across the board, across the world, in my view, the controllers could see the danger of this, because reason and freedom, as Ayn Rand said, are corollaries. They go together. And if you want to control people, you must dumb them down. You must remove their capacity to intellectually resist what you're doing. And I believe that this happened. And the philosopher that there was a trend starting, but the key philosopher that began this was Immanuel Kant in his seminal work, A Critique of Pure Reason. Now, stop me if I'm going on too much, no. but Kant grew up in the Enlightenment, in an era where there was an amazing sense of optimism, where people believed that the new birth of science and reason could solve all of humanity's problems, and it threatened religion. It threatened the establishment, religion particularly. And Immanuel Kant comes along in 1781 with his seminal work, where he poses as a rational man, as a champion of reason, and he proceeds to demolish reason. And since Kant, you've got the whole wave of what was called idealism, philosophical idealism, which again is all about the idea that no, reality isn't a fixed absolute. In fact, it's a projection of human consciousness. This is the essence of Kant's work. And he's a hugely influential philosopher. Almost all mainstream philosophy today is a result of, basically following Kantism. It's all this idealism. We've got, there's the exception probably being Ayn Rand's Subjectivism. So I think that this idea, this opinion of mine, is that it's inconceivable that while reason was delivering the goods all around, it's inconceivable that philosophers could really sit around and think, gosh, now, can we really know reality? Does reason work? It was working. It was demonstrably working in front of them. So this is
Let me add something to that. I want to critique that a little bit. Not critique,
yeah.
But challenge it, open up a discussion, although we haven't got too long left. To what extent do you think these patterns are cyclical? Do we enter periods where we reach the bounds of reason, and therefore we see this reaction? Okay, throughout history, these different philosophies and worldviews have taken different names and different meanings, but to what extent is this a form of cause and effect and response? So you have the world of the mysticism that you talked about, that it's not necessarily observable reality. Some might argue that some of it is, but
if it is observable, then it's part of reality, and you don't need mysticism to justify it.
Right, but you will get these things that will become pervasive in culture, and then people will go so far from reason that they return to it, like you said, with the Renaissance. To what extent do you think we have this? Are we just bouncing off the walls and keep...
Yeah, great question. I think that we haven't even approached reaching the bounds of reason yet, as you hinted at the beginning of your question there. Reason delivers the goods. It's our means of survival. It's how the human mind functions. We mustn't forget that. I think the problem is that, and there's very likely a cycle through history of reason coming in and out of fashion, you could say. That's possibly not the most accurate word, but it comes and goes. When we look at things like the pyramids, when we look at things like the Baalbek, I think, in Lebanon, and various other structures on planet Earth that clearly have been built with a superior technology than we possess today. I mean, that should be obvious, and yet our mainstream culture denies that. This clearly points to the fact that there was technology, superior technology, sometime in the past, and this is evidence for this cyclical thing. I think that it's the danger of mysticism. It's the danger of the temptation of people to sort of shortcut reason. Reason's hard work. It takes effort to gain knowledge. The idea of feeling your way to knowledge, the idea of going with mysticism is just accept it. Well, that's nice and easy. Here you go. Here's a load of ideas. Just accept them. Done and dusted. It's a really tempting thing. So I think if there is a cycle, it would be. I think it's quite likely that there is a cycle of civilizations literally peaking and falling and crumbling due to the abandonment of reason. We can see the historical evidence of ancient Greece, a hugely significant cultural peak where reason was actually first identified by Aristotle, Plato's contemporary. And then we can see that Rome, riding on the back of the Greek achievements, the philosophical achievements, the high valuing of reason within the culture, and then eventually sort of tailing off with faith and force being used by the Roman Empire, and eventually it crumbles. We have 1,000 years of the Dark Ages, and then we see rebirth of reason. Suddenly it becomes fashionable again. Everyone goes, wow, look at this reason thing. We can invent electricity or discover electricity, etc., etc. So I think there is a cycle, and I think the danger that ends the period of reason can be when humans start to adopt the wrong, false ideas, namely at the root of it, this idea of human consciousness creating a reality, reintroduced largely by Immanuel Kant. And I think it was done deliberately. Although that's not really a serious issue, you don't need to know whether it's done deliberately. The real point is it's happening, and the real point is that's a false idea. We have to stand consciously on the true idea, recognizing that we are in our daily functioning, and then be consistent with it.
I'd love to have you back to debate this with someone who stands strong behind Kant, because it's just it makes for phenomenal discussion, because there are so many nuances to this discussion, and it's just beautiful to actually play with those ideas. And
there's lots of different avenues you can go down.
Yeah, and it's really important that we are able to play with those ideas. Now, we're almost out of time, and I know you're going to be sharing a lot more of this at the People's Reset and helping people to really hone their faculties of reason. But I want to leave our listeners or viewers today with just some of your top strategies for honing one's reasoning ability. What's most important? What's the most important thing that people can do in this age that we're in, where you could argue objectivity is under threat? What to you is the most important strategy that we need to have at our disposal?
Yeah, great question. We need to develop our thinking skills broadly. We need to develop our personal sovereignty if we want to achieve freedom. Personal sovereignty must mean, to start with, thought always precedes action. Personal sovereignty must mean intellectual independence, which is this ability to gain knowledge. So the first thing you have to do is decide you want to know. You have to say, damn it, I'm going to find out. Yes. And I want to understand. I don't want to be told and accept, because that's faith, and that's no good to anyone. I can't be certain with that. So I want to understand. I want to know is the first thing. That's ground zero. From there are a number of principles. For example, revisiting these fundamental convictions, as I hinted earlier on. There aren't many of them. There's 3, maybe 4 basic ideas where you've got to decide which way you're going at the fork of the road. And one of these ideas gives you the law of non-contradiction, which is the basic epistemological principle. It's the basic principle of thinking, of reasoning, and working out what's true and what isn't, because we all know contradictions don't exist. And so if we see one, in our thinking, we must resolve it. Or if we hear one out there in the narrative, if somebody says climate change is a real threat and somebody says it isn't, there's a contradiction. We can't rest until we've resolved that. In other words, we need to dig and find what are the arguments for that, what are the arguments for this, and then weigh those arguments. So stop me if I'm saying too much.
I mean, I could probably open up for another hour on that last point alone, just on the simple observable.
The starting point is wanting to know, and
absolutely.
the desire to understand,
Yes.
and the distinction, I think, between just accepting and understanding. If you understand something, you can explain it because you can connect it back to reality. That's the distinction. If you can understand why human beings need to be free, which I don't think most people do, it means you're connecting it back to the facts of reality, the facts of our human nature, what sort of consciousness we possess, etc., etc. So understanding, I think, is the basic one. Just to answer your question and wrap it up.
Thank you, Nigel. Well, to our viewers and listeners at home, you have the opportunity to come and meet Nigel at the People's Reset this September the 27th to the 29th. What are you going to be sharing with us at the People's Reset?
Well, I'm going to be challenging people to visit these fundamental ideas. I'm going to be talking a little bit about ideas and how powerful they are. A very, very touch upon introduction to the idea of the study of fundamental ideas, which is philosophy, without putting everyone to sleep, of course, but inviting everyone to revisit these ideas, which are, funnily enough, very controversial. They're ideas that we're already acting upon, and yet we are intellectually entertaining their opposites. And what I'm going to hope to do is bring 3, maybe 4 ideas into people's awareness, and then leave them to go away with probably hundreds of questions.
Very exciting, very exciting. In the meantime, then, where can people start to connect with some of your work?
My website is lawfulrebel.com, and the podcast is Living Outside the Matrix, and my work is on there. I'm currently working on this book, The Truth Seeker's Guide, that you mentioned, and hopefully a lot more guidance will be contained within that. It's coming out in 4 parts, and the first part should be available by the end of this year.
I can't help but call it The Truth Seeker's Guide to the Galaxy in my head.
Like it.
Well, Nigel, it's been a pleasure having you with us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Please hit the share button. This has been an incredible discussion. This type of conversation I could have all day long, but we're tight for time today. So to continue that conversation, come and meet us at the People's Reset. Do check out Nigel's work. And please share this episode to help get this conversation into the public dialogue, because it is vitally important that we question the basis of our ideas, and particularly in the terrain that we're in now where truth is under threat. So thanks again for watching. Please share this.